What if Meister Eckhart had succeeded? Saint Eckhart? Wouldn't that be wild? It almost happened with one of his followers, Henry Suso, blessed Henry Suso. So he hasn't been canonized, he's not saint, but nevertheless, it's not impossible because there are a lot of the same ideas in there. But what if Eckhart had won? This is not just a personal question with respect to this particular Dominican friar. What we're really talking about is what was going on in the condemnatory bull and how it is that in Agro Dominico condemned some of the things that Eckhart supposedly said because they were afraid of the effect on the uneducated and easily influenced. And so if some people were too easily influenced and they were afraid that that influence was dangerous, then you had something that wasn't necessarily wrong or evil in itself, but it was malsonantes. It was evil sounding. It was the sort of thing that, well, it wasn't really wrong, but it kind of sounds bad, and maybe even sounds bad in the form of leading people astray. Now, leading people astray, obviously, you don't want people to be led astray. Like that's a bad thing. I mean, being on the right path, even if you don't know what you're doing, you're at least going the right direction. So there's nothing wrong necessarily with that concern. But historically, what this led to was a division, a movement in a certain direction for the Catholic Church, and then what would eventually become the Protestant Reformation, so that the Catholics and the Protestants were going in the same direction, away from the mysticism of their past. And because of that, then, I have argued, we end up separating from what would become the modern world and the modern perspective, the modern sentiment with respect to what it is that people feel and are inclined to do with religion. And so what this means is the church went one direction, the church being Christianity in general, not just Catholicism, and the world went a different direction. And so you feel this increasing divide, and now you have a lot of people leaving institutionalized religion, institutionalized Christianity. But what if Eckhart had won? What if he had succeeded and his version of the individual, which, by the way, was compatible with and presaged the modern individual? So a lot of what he had to say about the individual and the way that he talked about the self is the kind of thing that was later going to be exaggerated or found in an exaggerated form with Giordano Bruno, and then leading into directly the modern world. And so this is, I think, a potentially very interesting and provocative question, because if Eckhart had succeeded, then we would be in a very different situation potentially with religion. So before the Reformation and before the Catholic Church lost its grip on the modern world, you had a figure like Nicholas of Cusa. And so Cusanus, Nicholas of Cusa, Cusanus is his Latin name, he was about a century or so after Meister Eckhart, doing a lot of his writing between like 1440 and 1460. And this is, 150, 130 years after a lot of the work that we get from Meister Eckhart. Well, what's interesting about this is that Cusanus described, among other things, the novelty, the creating of things. And he used the example of a wooden spoon, which was very prosaic, and maybe there's a better example, but anyway, go with it, right? So he talked about people creating genuinely new things. Well, that idea of creating something genuinely new turned out to be really important for the modern world. And so Cusanus was doing something that was compatible with modernity. He was presaging a lot of what was going to happen in the modern world, that we think that we're discovering new things, that we are creating new mathematics and new science and doing new things and discoveries, and it's great. And that was inside of the church. He was a cardinal. He was papal legate. He was someone who had the Pope's authority in traveling. And so he was highly placed in the church in the same way that Meister Eckhart was highly placed in the church. He was a master of theology, the highest degree that you could receive. And so, these kinds of things in the 1200s and 1300s, early 1300s with Eckhart, and then in the mid 1400s with Nicholas of Cusa, we were still within the Christian tradition in doing a lot of what would eventually become the modern world. But there was a decisive break at a certain point, but it didn't have to go that way. And if it hadn't gone that way, arguably, if Christianity, instead of rejecting not only what was going on with Galileo famously, but also Bruno and also Eckhart, if they'd instead gone that direction, then I think things could have turned out very, very differently. Because the problem is now, nihilism, the vacuum of meaning, that nothing matters and nothing is important. This is felt very strongly by a lot of people today, where they want meaning, They want their lives to have some kind of meaning, but they don't know what to turn to. And religion just doesn't work for them because religion took that turn and decided that Eckhart and Bruno and even Cusanus to some extent weren't at least officially right for the lay people. And so that kind of thing created a situation where, okay, now we have nihilism and the lack of meaning in most people's lives. And Nietzsche was sounding the alarm bells with this in the late 1800s for anyone who would listen. And the 20th century generally has been, in agreement that, okay, Nietzsche saw something coming here, and this is really a problem for people now. What do we do? How do we live? It seems like we want meaning, we want knowledge, but how can we get either one of those? What are we going to do? Well, again, Eckhart had an answer to this, and he saw this problem coming to some extent, in that his famous idea of living without a why addresses the problem of nihilism. So to live without a why is to live without need for a purpose, in the sense that things that have whys, things that have purposes, are those that are directed towards goals within the corporeal world, within the world of time, and therefore at a distance for Eckhart from God. And so any kind of why that you might have is going to mean that you haven't gotten there yet. You haven't fully achieved union with God. And so living without a why was Eckhart's recommendation. Think about this. What would it mean for us to live without a why? What would it mean for us to not have the usual set of goals and purposes that people typically have? And that kind of thing people have latched on to today, but they haven't done it inside of Christianity. They've gotten that from the East. They've gotten it from Buddhism, among other places, which is why one of my favorites to mention is Daisetsu Suzuki's work, Daisetsu Suzuki in Zen was part of the, force that brought over a lot of Buddhism from Japan to the United States, which is why Zen is so popular here. Suzuki was one of the big figures in doing that. And in the 1950s, he discovered Eckhart and wrote a book on Eckhart, Mysticism, East and West. And so he directly addresses Eckhart and Buddhism and comes to the conclusion that Eckhart had a satori, that they were fundamentally, Eckhart was a mystic in just the same way that Buddhism has mysticism. And so what Eckhart was doing was basically Buddhism, that it was not different from it at the very least. And Buddhism is not like a competing religion. It's the kind of thing where you can find it in a variety of places, which is why you have people who can be, Buddhist and Christian, Buddhist and Jewish, Buddhist and whatever, right? Which is why some people actually say it's a philosophy rather than a religion, because it is not exclusive in that way. Anyway, so that's kind of interesting. And that led, by the way, Houston Smith to point out in the end of the preface from The Essential Eckhart, which is a book from, a number of decades ago, that Houston Smith is a scholar on religion, has written a number of books, really an excellent writer. He said that most people basically just don't know that this is a part of Christianity. They don't realize that this is out there. They just see the kind of what he called childish sentimentality of Christianity in the very simplistic form that appeals even to children. And they don't see beyond that because most of the time that's not the kind of stuff that we hear, unfortunately. And I remember when I was researching St. Gregory, who was a mystic, one of the things that I found was a sermon that was given on his feast day. And I'm like, oh, great, let's find out what people say about it. It had nothing to do with his mysticism. There was nothing in there at all. And that's really disappointing. And so even on the opportunity to talk about this particular person, it still isn't done. And so unfortunately, this just doesn't happen very much. And so a lot of people who are mystically inclined, who are spiritually inclined, who find a lot of utility in the East, in Zen Buddhism, and in Hinduism, and in a variety of, I'm thinking of Alan Watts and Krishnamurti and, people like that. That kind of stuff appeals to people. It has a big audience for people, even with Eckhart, by the way. You have Eckhart Tolle. Well, the Eckhart portion of that he took because of Meister Eckhart, but his message is something that combines a lot of basically the flavor not only of Eckhart, but ideas in the East and that sort of thing. And this speaks to people. It speaks to people in a way that modern institutionalized Christianity, in what Houston Smith said was a kind of childish sentimentality, that just doesn't speak to people in the same way. And as Smith said, that they see the outer door, They see the outer doors of the church, so to speak, that welcomes absolutely everyone. But what they don't realize is that there's an inner door. And the inner door is something like mysticism. And for those who are mystically inclined, by the way, this is in Christianity. And you can knock on that door. And as Smith nicely put it, Eckhart will be one of those waiting to welcome you. So I think that's worthwhile. And I think it's worth knowing that the modern quest for spirituality, in the sense that a lot of people are no longer identifying as being religious in the form of being Christian or being whatever it might happen to be, but they still identify themselves somehow loosely as spiritual. In other words, they still want something, but the stuff that they see on the buffet is not appealing to them. And they don't realize that there's another menu. And so I think that's worthwhile. It's worthwhile knowing what's out there. It's worthwhile knowing someone like Meister Eckhart, that there is this within Christianity, even within Orthodox Catholicism. Not that that necessarily matters for a lot of people. And if you're not going to be a part of the institution, it doesn't matter to you. But it's salient, I think, that this has been a part of the tradition for thousands of years, and he's just one of the exponents of it. It just so happens that he's an exponent at the time where the modern notion of the self, the modern notion of the individual was just coming into form, and he was starting to play with those ideas, which is why so much of his rhetoric sounds so good to us now and still resonates with people, including the idea of living without a why, which, by the way, addresses Nietzsche's concern with nihilism. And Nietzsche was making this known in the, 1870s and 1880s? And Meister Eckhart is writing between 1290 and 1327. This is a really long time before Nietzsche. So it's in the tradition. It's in the West. It's just that most people aren't aware that it's even there, which is why I think Eckhart is so useful for people today. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was interesting, and maybe, as usual, of course, with Eckhart and in general with my stuff, hopefully not what you expect. So I hope it's good to think with.